Thank you for joining us for this edition of The World Today, a program of Perry World House, the University of Pennsylvania's Global Affairs Policy Center. Our program today features some of the leading thinkers on viruses and infection, vaccinations, and the pandemic. It's sure to be both rich and a timely discussion. Today, we're speaking with Dr. Paul Offit and Dr. Susan Weiss, who will be in conversation with Jennifer Pinto-Martin. Dr. Pinto-Martin is the Viola McInnes Independence Professor in the Biobehavioral Health Sciences in the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing, with a secondary appointment in the Department of Epidemiology in the Perelman School of Medicine. She currently serves as the ombudsperson for Penn and the executive director of Penn's Center for Public Health Initiatives. She is the former director of the Master of Public Health program and has served as both a department chair and chair of the University Faculty Senate. She has been part of Penn's COVID response team since the start of the pandemic and has been deeply involved in all public health decisions related to COVID and the campus community. Joining her on our virtual stage is Dr. Paul Offit, director of the Vaccine Education Center at CHOP, as well as the Maureen R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology and a Professor of Pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at Penn. He has published more than 160 papers in medical and scientific journals in the areas of rotavirus-specific immune responses and vaccine safety. He is also the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine RotaTeq. Dr. Offit is currently a member of the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee and is a founding advisory board member of the Autism Science Foundation and the Foundation for Vaccine Research. He's the author of numerous books. Also joining us virtually on our panel of experts today is Dr. Susan Weiss, who's a professor and vice chair of the Department of Microbiology and co-director of the Penn Center for Research on Coronaviruses and Other Emerging Pathogens at the Perelman School of Medicine. The center seeks to centralize coronavirus research efforts and enhance collaboration between research scientists and clinicians. Dr. Weiss's long-term research interest is in pathogenesis of murine and human coronaviruses, with a current focus on virus interaction and the host innate immune response. Thank you so much to all three of you for joining us today. Jennifer, the floor is yours to share some introductory thoughts and to begin our program.
Welcome to everyone. I hope that all of you are staying safe and healthy and managing to weather this curveball that the epidemic has thrown at us. I'm really honored to kick off the Perry World House Today seminar series. As LaShawn mentioned, my name is Jennifer Pinto-Martin. I'm a faculty member in the School of Nursing and the Perelman School of Medicine. I'm also a newly appointed faculty fellow at Perry World House, which I'm very excited about. I'll be focusing my work on climate change and child health. But it strikes me that there are similarities between the COVID epidemic and the climate crisis in the following way. Things are changing so rapidly, more rapidly than anyone anticipated. And this means that we are forced to make decisions in a climate of imperfect and incomplete information. I feel that as part of the COVID response team. I'm sure our guests feel that in the work that they do. It makes for a very challenging situation. But we have these two distinguished colleagues here today that hopefully will help fill the gap and teach us the things that we need to know about COVID-19. So I'm going to start with Susan and ask Susan to talk a little bit about viruses and variants. And how do variants emerge? What do we know about sort of the natural history of variant evolution and virus evolution? So Susan, please take it away.
Am I unmuted now? Yeah. Okay. So I'm a basic scientist who studied coronaviruses for a very long time. So I want to use what we know about the biology of these viruses to explain, or at least in part explain, why we have variants and why some of them are of concern, so to speak. So coronaviruses have RNA genomes. That means that they don't have any DNA. They use RNA as their only genetic material. And when they replicate that RNA, it's a very, those enzymes that do that are not very precise and they make errors. So every time the RNA viruses replicate, they're creating mutations or mutants. And many of these mutations are either detrimental or kind of neutral and they just die out. But any mutation that really gives the virus an advantage to grow or to replicate or to spread is going to be selected for. It's really just natural selection of mutant viruses. And so it's the environmental conditions that decides this, and viruses really want to spread. They don't really particularly benefit by killing their hosts. So mutations are selected that allow the virus to be more fit and spread and replicate better. And so we've seen a series of variants emerging during the SARS pandemic. And they each have a constellation of mutations in them, and most of them are in the so-called spike gene. So the spike protein, I think everyone's heard of by now, that's the protein on the outside of the virus particle that attaches to the host cell and allows the virus to enter the cell. It's also really important for spread from cell to cell. And so most of the mutations that we see in these variants that have taken over are in the spike protein. And so just for the moment, and remember that the spike protein is the major target or the only target of most of the vaccines we have available today, the mRNA vaccines, as well as the adenovirus-based vaccines. So these series of mutants have emerged originally in England and UK, et cetera, and they were originally named for the places they come from, but that naming system has been replaced by Greek letters. So we have alpha, beta, gamma, delta. I think we're about up to lambda now. And actually that makes a lot more sense because although these viruses did arise in a certain place, they've spread, and these same mutations arise in viruses all over the world. So we might see a Delta-like virus. In fact, we are seeing a lot of Delta-like viruses at CHOP and at HUP right now when we sometimes get these viruses from clinical samples, and they're almost all Delta now. So it makes more sense to call them by these more neutral names than by where they come from, because they are both spreading and arising in other places. Okay, so Delta's kind of taken over the world in terms of the predominant virus, and it's probably because there's so much replication that it just keeps propagating. And so some of these viruses are just called viruses of interest, or VOIs. Some of them are called VOCs, or viruses of concern, or variants of concern. And I just want to describe a few reasons why they might be of concern. They're kind of different mechanisms. So many of these variants, or the mutations in the variants, they allow the virus, the spike protein, to attach better to its receptor and therefore enter the cells more easily. And these same mutations might allow the virus to spread faster. Another kind of mutation they have is in the so-called furin cleavage site, which some of you might have heard of because it's gotten quite famous. But this is just a sequence in the spike protein that there has to be a cleavage or a cutting of the sequence in order for the spike protein to mediate viral entry. And so some of these viruses, the alpha and the delta virus, have mutations near this cleavage site, which make it cleave more efficiently, which would again seem to make the virus enter cells better and spread better. And the third kind of mutation is probably the most troublesome, and that would be an epitope escape mutation. That would be a mutation that allows the virus to escape one type of antibody. But there are so many different antibodies that are elicited by the vaccines or by a natural infection that one mutation that would cause a bit of an escape does not make the vaccine ineffective. And maybe Paul will talk about this to some extent. But as far as I understand, all the vaccines are working against all the variants quite efficiently still now. So again, as I said before, most of the mutations that are selected for are in the spike protein, but there are also going to be mutations in other genes. For example, these viruses are very large genomes, and they have a lot of proteins in them that are simply there to protect the virus against the host response. And so mutations in these genes may make the virus even more virulent or just a better virus. And I should say that so far, none of these variants make people more sick. They just may spread better. And sometimes that's actually reciprocal. So viruses that spread better may become more attenuated or less virulent because, again, the selection is for the ability to spread, not for the ability to cause sickness. And just to sort of wrap up, so because variants arise when viruses replicate. If we would just get everybody vaccinated, I think that's the best insurance against making further variants. And we can talk later maybe about what we might think come in the future. But again, the variants are just a product of virus replication, and making the virus stop replicating is probably the best medicine to get rid of them. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. That was a great description. And I do want to put a pin in that mitigation strategy that you sort of threw out at the end, because that's something we'd like to talk about a little bit more. So now I'm going to turn to you, Paul, for some introductory remarks. And I'm going to ask you to talk about boosters, because everybody's talking about boosters these days, and everybody thinks that they need to get a booster. And I know you have some thoughts about the value of the booster and why this has come about. So turn it over to you.
Right. So in December, when the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee reviewed the 2 mRNA vaccines, the phase 3 trials of the mRNA vaccines, we were hoping that you would have at least 70% protection against mild, moderate, and severe disease. It was actually much better than that. It was around 95% for both the Pfizer and Moderna products. And that set an expectation, I think, for what people could expect for this vaccine that was a little high. Remember, when we looked at those data, we could say that those vaccines were protective at the 95% level for about 3 months, because that's the length of follow-up that we had. And then the vaccines came out into the real world. The goal of this vaccine is to protect against severe critical disease, the kind of disease that causes you to be so sick that you have to seek medical attention or go to the hospital or go to the intensive care unit or die. That's the goal of the vaccine, because over time, these kinds of vaccines generally will have an erosion in protection against asymptomatic infection or mildly symptomatic infection, and generally will have an erosion in the titer of neutralized virus-specific neutralizing antibodies that's in the sera. That's what you would expect to have happen. And so that's what happened. What's happened now over the past 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, is that there has been an increase in people who, despite being vaccinated, are nonetheless getting an infection, either asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. Unfortunately, we have labeled those breakthrough infections. It's not a breakthrough. It's what you would expect to have happen. So, for example, in that Provincetown outbreak that occurred in Barnabas County, Massachusetts, where thousands of men get together to celebrate July 4th, 79% of them were vaccinated, but nonetheless, 346 of them became infected. So despite being vaccinated, they developed COVID. Of those 346, 4 were hospitalized. That's 1.2%. That means the vaccine is still working very well. And unfortunately, the CDC has labeled those breakthrough infections. A true breakthrough infection is somebody who, despite being vaccinated, is fully vaccinated, is nonetheless hospitalized. And so I think we've set up this unrealistic expectation. So I actually give you a quote. I'm going to quote Lindsey Graham, who, is not typically quoted on any scientific or medical show, but he did actually get something right. So I think he deserves a moment here. When he was fully vaccinated, and he, no doubt because he was hanging out with his Republican friends and who were unmasked and sick, he actually, despite being fully vaccinated, was himself developed COVID and had mild upper respiratory symptoms associated with sinusitis. And he said, quote, "It would have been much worse if I hadn't been vaccinated." Right. That's exactly right. So again, we turn to our Republicans when we're looking for, good science-based information. So in any case, what happened is that a few weeks ago, the Biden administration declared in this kind of ex cathedra manner that we should have a booster dose, that it should be given roughly 8 months after the second dose. And the thinking behind this, according to Dr. Fauci and others, is that because they're seeing now an erosion in neutralizing antibodies, or because they're seeing an erosion in protection against mild or asymptomatic infection, which I think would be expected, that therefore right around the corner is going to be a loss in protection about what we really care about, which is protection against serious disease. Now that's unlikely to be true, because usually protection against serious disease is actually, it's much easier actually to protect against serious disease. It's much easier to keep your entire house from burning down than it is from preventing a small fire in the kitchen, because it's mediated by immunological memory cells, which tend to be longer lived. There was actually just a paper that came out of John Weary's lab, actually at Penn, looking at the protection or the persistence of memory cells after natural infection and vaccination, found just what you would expect, which is that it's generally long lived. So I think it was a mistake actually to make that recommendation, but Worse yet, it just went around the system that is in place. Normally what happens is you identify a problem. Let's say there is an erosion in protection against severe disease. And then you find that when you give that dose 8 months later, that erosion then decreases, is mediated by then that booster dose. And then those data then are presented to the Food and Drug Administration then so that one can reasonably call this a 3-dose vaccine. And then it goes to the CDC, the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practice, who then makes a recommendation either for the general public or for in a layered manner, say initially just those who are elderly or those who are immune compromised, not immune compromised, but those who have various comorbidities. It's already a 3-dose vaccine for those who are immune compromised. But it didn't happen that way. It was just a pronouncement, and it's just really confused people. There's been about 1 million people who've already gotten a 3rd-dose vaccine when technically neither the FDA nor the CDC has made that recommendation. The Advisory Committee for Immunization Practice met yesterday. They devoted the last hour and a half to that. And basically they said, this is not a 3rd-dose, this is not a 3-dose vaccine yet. We will consider that, I think, by the end of September, this all will be put in place. But I think it's been very confusing people. So right now, I would say the people who've gotten 2 doses of this vaccine should feel that they are protected against sort of severe critical disease and not feel that they're under immunized, because if we're going to hold up this as a 3-dose vaccine, exactly how does that play out then with regard to mandates, et cetera? It was just really bad communication. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Paul. So, a million questions have popped into my head, but I'm going to go with this one that came when Susan was talking as well, which is, so what should we have done? Should we take those 3rd doses? And if we're talking about mitigation for this epidemic worldwide, what's the best use of the vaccines that we have available? Is it a booster dose for those who are vulnerable, or a booster dose for everyone? Or is it spreading the vaccine throughout the world where, we know there are countries that have 2% of their population vaccinated? So in terms of mitigation, what are your thoughts? And then I want to hear from Susan as well.
Right, so there are 195 countries in this world. Many have not given a single dose of vaccine. I mean, this is a global epidemic, right? It's a pandemic. Therefore, what happens, how much more information do we need that what happens in other countries affects this country? So I do think certainly best use of that 3rd dose here would be to put it into other countries. But even more importantly, frankly, or as importantly, the problem in this country right now with the fact that we continue to see, tens of thousands of cases and hundreds of deaths is not because we haven't boosted the vaccinated, it's because we haven't vaccinated the unvaccinated. And until we do that, we're not going to get on top of this pandemic. And you have now a solid 25 to 30% of this country who are saying no thanks to the vaccine. We're okay with continuing to be fertile ground for this virus to reproduce itself, to create variants which may become progressively more resistant to vaccine-induced immunity. And so what are you going to do about it? I think that's where the rubber is going to meet the road over the next 6 months or so, which is at the level of, on the one hand, mandating something you shouldn't have to mandate. There's no good reason not to get a vaccine, just a lot of bad reasons. I think that anybody who's looked at the data would get this vaccine in a second. But I think that's where the rubber is going to meet the road. You're going to see this fight in this society between, on the one hand, public health requirements that affect us all, and on the other hand, these sort of claims of personal freedom, which have nothing to do with personal freedom. This is not it's not your right to catch and transmit a potentially fatal infection. It doesn't just involve you. If I choose not to get a tetanus vaccine and get tetanus, that's not going to affect anybody else because it's not a contagious disease. This is a contagious disease, and it's not your right to transmit it. And that's where this fight, I think, is going to be happening in this country for a while.
I totally agree. Write that essay, please, because a lot of people need to read that. Susan, what about you in terms of mitigation strategies? What do you think about, where do you think we should be devoting our resources at this point?
Well, I definitely agree with what Paul said. I feel like we could spend many months trying to hide from this virus, trying to hide from Delta, and doing all these things when there's a whole bunch of other people out there getting infected and spreading the virus. And I think it's really very selfish. And I agree with Paul. I don't really understand it. And I think just from a science perspective, as I said, the more it replicates, the more it has a possibility to make variants. And I wonder whether the virus, so part of the making variants is acclimating to human. This is related to the other subject of where the virus came from. It's a zoonotic virus, so it's adjusting to humans. And maybe at some point it's sort of asymptotic and it'll finish adjusting. And as Paul sort of alluded to, the scarier part is developing immune resistant viruses. I don't think that's around the corner because, as I said, one mutation does not make someone immune to a vaccine-induced immunity. I think the monoclonal antibodies are a little bit scarier because you could imagine getting a virus resistant to them. But yeah, so bottom line is I agree with Paul that getting the rest of the country vaccinated is probably the most important thing, and in addition to the rest of the world. But
right. And the last mile is always the hardest, as we know in public health. Well, so you touched on it. Let's ask directly what your thoughts are about the theories of the origin. There's a conspiracy theory that it was leaked from the lab. I know you have thoughts about that, and we'd love to hear from you about that.
There's kind of two conspiracy theories. The most far out one, I think, is that some evil scientist generated it in the lab with by genetically modifying something. That's totally, I don't think any scientist would believe that one, because in order to, quote, make a virus, you have to start with a virus. You don't make them de novo. They have these very long 30,000 units of genetic material. And so you have to start with a virus that exists, and then yes, you can modify it. But this doesn't look like a modified virus. So I think we can really throw that one off the table. And the other thing is that it looks from its sequence and from people have been looking at bat viruses for a really long time. It looks like it could have come from a bat virus. And the reason we think that too is because the two previous coronavirus epidemics, not really pandemics, SARS-1 and MERS epidemics, were both from bat-derived viruses that were transmitted to humans through an intermediate species. In the case of the first SARS epidemic, a civet cat, and in case of the MERS, camels. So camels are a huge reservoir for coronaviruses that leak into the human population, but in the Middle East. So there's precedence, and I mean, to me, the simplest explanation is it sort of is a similar kind of transmission as the first two. Of course, it's really hard to rule out that it didn't somehow get from a bat to a human by some, quote, accidental route. And so one possibility is that people looking for bats in bat caves somebody could have been infected. But I still don't think that's the most likely explanation. I'm sure. So as I said before, the phrase lab leak is kind of a misnomer because the virus would never leak out of the lab unless it was inside of a human. And we know that there were no viruses like this, or this virus was not in the lab, unless we think that the lab head, who I don't think this is true, is completely lying. She says she's never seen this virus. So I think the most likely explanation is the simplest one. And in fact, this last group of when the WHO went there to investigate in the Wuhan lab, I mean, basically they found that the earliest cases really did surround this market. This is a different part of the city from the Wuhan lab. There's also a transfer of the Chinese CDC in Wuhan, and they could also have been bat hunting. So it's kind of been all focused on Dr. Shi in the Wuhan lab, I think a little bit unfairly. So we don't know for sure. And I think the only way we're going to know for sure is when and if someone can find the precursor virus, something very, very close to this virus in an intermediate species and or in a bat.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my 2 cents.
Great, thank you very much. Paul, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about sort of pivoting back to mutation. I've read that viruses tend to mutate a lot in the beginning when they're first introduced to a human population. And I think, we've touched on that, but can we talk a little bit about what we might expect, sort of the natural history of variants emerging and then us sort of settling down to something that we can handle?
Actually, I think Susan, for coronaviruses, I think Susan is the better person to answer that question than me.
Okay, Susan, take it away.
What do we say? What we expect?
So you touched on this already, but this notion that when a virus is introduced to a human population, it mutates a lot until it sort of adapts to humans, and then the mutations sort of calm down. I've read that before, and I just would like you to say it and to reassure people that this is not going to happen forever. It's not going to be mutation after mutation.
I think that's true. Like I said before, I don't know this for sure, but it could become asymptotic, that it makes so many mutations. It's adjusting so well to the human that it's going to be like the most fit possible virus for spreading among humans. The only danger is the epitope escape, which I personally don't think is going to happen anytime soon. But the curious thing is that, and I don't understand this, that very early in the epidemic, there was one mutation in the spike protein that arose, this D614G, and everybody was very just talking about it a lot. And it turns, it's now in every single virus that's ever isolated, and it's probably just a fitness mutation. So that one came up really early, and then there really weren't any for a while. And then I guess these alpha, beta, gamma variants started probably around, I think, the end of last year. So that's a little curious why there was a gap and when it started to really change. Yeah. So, and so far, I mean, there's some viruses I was just reading today that in India that came after Delta, but are not taking over. So Delta seems to be a really quite a virus.
Yes. It's up the transmission game for sure. So let's talk about Delta on university campus. And just, I'd like to hear both of your thoughts on how do you think we'll fare as we come back to school this week with this circulating Delta variant. You know, the COVID response team have put all of the precautions we can in place, but we know that this variant is much more transmissible. And what's your prediction of sort of how the semester will unfold, if I can ask you to do that?
Can I say one other thing about Delta and about all these variants? And this might be an unpopular thing to say, but I think it's really hard to completely separate the transmissible of the transmissibility of the virus and any changes in human behavior. Like I read somewhere that when Delta really started flourishing, it was a time when people started really hanging out together in groups and being close together. And the same, and I think that was even true for the Alpha. I didn't believe that the Alpha virus was more transmissible when I first started hearing about it. And I'm not an epidemiologist at all, so I don't really understand those studies. So I don't know really how, I mean, I believe Delta is more transmissible, but I don't know how much. I don't know what.
It's a great point, Susan, and I can tell you from the epidemiology side and the contact tracing side, the number of contacts that we're seeing when we identify an index case is much greater than it was under Alpha. And that's because people have loosened their guard and then they're circulating more thoroughly. So I think you're right, it's really hard to tease apart, but you also hear that the viral load is much greater with Delta. And so that, to me, would make me imagine it was more transmissible. And so coupled with relaxed social mores, it's sort of a perfect storm.
Careful about viral load, because viral load is usually RNA genomes, and it's not infection.
Okay.
And so the ratio of infectious virus to viral genomes is not fixed. And sometimes you can have a virus that may be more stable. You may have less infectious virus per genome. I mean, I could be totally wrong. I just think you have to think about these things a little bit more carefully. And in fact, very weirdly, we have growing these viruses in our lab, and Delta is the hardest one to actually assay for some reason. It's not so easy to grow and purify and quantify. So
interesting.
I don't know, but I mean, I still think obviously we have to be really cautious, whether we're Alpha, Delta, or wild type, whatever. I mean, I think we have to be really careful. All these students. I mean, I went and had my COVID test yesterday, and there were just so many people in that tent getting tested. It's a little bit.
Thank you. So, Paul, any thoughts about what this semester and this year might look like under COVID at Penn and at other places?
Yeah, no, I think the one point that Susan made was just right on. Is it's really hard to separate sort of transmissibility from the virus just alone to behavior. I mean, think about it. If you compare this August with last August, or at least the end of this August with last August, we're worse off. I mean, we have more cases and more deaths than we did at the end of last August, when at that time we had a fully susceptible population and no vaccine. And I think there's two reasons for that. I think one is that Delta probably is more transmissible than Alpha, hence it's taking over. But two is our behavior so much different. I mean, you think about it. Remember last year they had that Sturgis bikers convention where all those guys without masks were sort of riding around. That was all the news. I mean, that dominated news. This year was just a blip because we've loosened up. And I think that leads into your question about how things are going to play out. I do think that it's not just a matter of sort of trying to sort of mask wear and social distance when you're inside. I just think that what happens when people go on campus and they're going to want to have a normal college life, where they get together at bars and hang out and, and drink and it's just, I just think that if we're not careful, it's going to be more problematic, because this has been true on other college campuses. So right. do worry. It's behavior. I think behavior is obviously get vaccinated, but in addition, you have to really be careful about your behavior.
And I can see that even in our own lab where, we were going maskless, but we were allowed to for a while, and now we're supposed to mask again. It's sort of fatigue. It's really hard to go back to masking, to go back to not eating together, all that stuff that we're supposed to not do. And we're adults, right?
Right, exactly. Imagine if you were in your 20s. I know. Yeah. So, I mean, I think we are putting all of those, guidelines, I will say, and in some cases mandates in place about behavior on campus. But we know from last year, when we had a fair number of students living in West Philadelphia and even some living on campus, that the transmission that occurred in social settings where people were unmasked and they were in close contact and not in the classroom. And we even have data from early Delta days that shows that transmission is not happening in the classroom. So I feel like if we can manage the external behavior a bit, we'll be okay. And if we can't, I have, some worries. I'm going to turn to some of the questions in the chat now and just ask you to address them. So this is for Paul. I understand that 2 doses means you're immunized. What kind of blood tests can we run 6 to 8 months time to determine what our level of immunity is?
I think you would drive yourself crazy by doing that. I mean, it assumes that and then now there is a commercially available test to detect virus-specific neutralizing antibodies. Prior to that, it was just binding antibodies. I'm not sure how much that taught you, but I think that, again, the goal really is to protect against the kind of disease that causes you to be sick, go to the hospital, et cetera. So for that, really, what you really want to know is sort of the frequency of memory B and T cells in your body, which is not commercially available. So I would say, don't drive yourself crazy with this. If you've gotten 2 doses of vaccine, assume that you are very, very likely to be among those who are going to be highly protected against severe disease, and don't drive yourself crazy.
Great. So sort of a follow on to that, what are the possibilities of developing a new vaccine that will more broadly cover coronaviruses generally, including potential variants? So both Paul and Susan, I'd like to hear from you on that.
So start with Susan. I'll follow.
Okay.
I'll just know that I know that Drew Weissman is on it already, and probably well. But I mean, that's been a really huge thing. People have been trying to do that for flu for a very long time. So I think it's a very, very difficult possibility, but it's a possibility. But you could also make a multivalent vaccine. You could put in an mRNA for SARS and MERS and SARS-2. But I also think we really need antivirals. I think that's really important because we don't know what the next one's going to be. We really don't know.
Mm-hmm.
These viruses replicate so similarly that there are many, many opportunities for developing drugs to, at least in the short term, until we get vaccines for everything, because it takes, even if we get a new virus, I'm sure it's going to be pretty quick to develop a vaccine, given what we've already done, or what Drew has already done. So, yeah, I think it's possible, but it's not around the corner.
Okay. Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that, I trained as Susan knows, I trained in Walter Gerhardt's lab many years ago, and he was working on a universal flu vaccine using matrix protein, and it's hard to do this. It's not the attempts to make a universal flu vaccine do not want for lack of money or lack of effort. It's just really hard to do. I remember Walter Gerhardt said to me something I'll never forget. He said, "If you want a research career that lasts for the rest of your life, study influenza." I think that's right. And so I think we talk about a universal coronavirus vaccine. That would be great, but not easy.
Right. Fair enough. So this is an interesting question. What percentage of the so-called breakthrough infections would you attribute to people lying about having been vaccinated because of the, sort of peer pressure to be vaccinated? Have either of you thought about that? I never have.
Never.
We should use the word breakthrough correctly. I mean,
yes.
Which is to say severe disease. No, and I suspect if it's severe disease, people would admit whether they've been vaccinated or not because they're either in the hospital or worse. But I don't know. I'm sure there's a lot of lying going on. And now that they're asking for people to get, for example, some restaurants or bars in New York are asking for you to show that you've been vaccinated. You already can get buy vaccine cards online without ever having to be vaccinated.
I will say on campus, we're being extremely careful to validate the information that we're getting. So I don't think we have any false vaccine cards in our records. So Susan, to you, SARS and MERS came back. So would you expect COVID-19 to return once we've sort of gotten through this initial second, whatever you want to call it, wave of the pandemic? Do you think it's going to be lurking?
I don't think SARS and MERS have come back. So SARS came and gone in 8 months. And the only other SARS after that was a couple of accidents in the lab. But MERS has been really different. It's still around since 2012. It never went away. And it's slow. There are people, I think there are maybe 2,500 cases total. And there's still cases accumulating. And here's something really interesting about MERS. So it's really almost endemic in camels in the Middle East and in Africa. But it's been shown now that the virus in the camels in Africa, and nobody gets the disease in Africa, only in the Middle East. So that's really interesting. It turns out that the virus in Africa is attenuated. It causes less disease and it doesn't spread to humans. So, but people think that that virus could mutate in a way to start infecting humans. So MERS could come back. SARS, well, it hasn't gone yet. So I think by the time we're done, we're going to all be immune to it one way or the other. And so it may hang around and become an endemic virus. A lot of people think that. I mean, the other coronaviruses we didn't talk about, the common cold viruses, OC432290, those viruses are, I think people now believe that they may have started as epidemics. And then people getting really sick, then young people get immune and it kind of melts into the background. And I think that's one thought of, some people think that's going to happen with SARS. Rather than go away and come back, it'll just kind of hang out and not be that lethal. That's what Paul thinks about that, but.
I agree. Actually, do you mind if I ask Susan the question since I have her here?
Of course, go for it.
Good. One thing I never quite understood, the virus presumably reproduces itself in the nasopharynx and then is shed as infectious virus, as whole virus for a week, 10 days, 2 weeks. But nonetheless, you're PCR positive for 3 months. You can be PCR positive for several months. My understanding, it's messenger RNA. I mean, it's messenger RNA I think of as a fairly labile molecule. So which is to say, I would imagine it would break down over time. Is it possible that this virus is just continuing to make genome? It's an abortive cycle of replication. If that is true, why would it do that?
It should. You're right. RNA should be labile and shouldn't hang around unless it's actively replicating. So I don't really have an explanation for that, except that I'll give you one story. For MHV, the mouse virus, this is really weird, but it persists in the brain for the lifetime of the mouse, and there's absolutely no infectious virus. We tried so hard to isolate virus. So there's some way that the RNA persists. There's mRNA, there's messenger RNA, which suggests it's making proteins, and there's genome, but there's no virus. So I don't really understand that. It's quite mysterious, but yeah, so I don't understand that. So again, but RNA is kind of a marker. It should be a marker for viral load, so to speak, but it's not always perfectly correlating.
Very interesting. Okay, I'm going to pivot a little bit to social behavior. So we have some questions around how we should behave. So, if we think of large events like weddings, attended by vaccinated individuals, we hope, should we think of them as dangerous? Should we normalize the situation and just move forward without feeling extreme anxiety? So from your professional perspectives, what would you say about that?
One for you, Paul.
I think were I to go to a wedding where there's going to be indoors, where there are a lot of people that I don't know. So I don't know whether they're vaccinated or not. I'm going to assume they're unvaccinated. I am, and I'm going to wear a mask, even though I'm sure that will upset some people, but because probably many won't be wearing masks. But that's sort of the way I see it. I don't trust this yet. We're still, this virus is still raging, and I think you have to take it seriously. So that's what I would say.
So I'm thinking of, we have a bar mitzvah coming up, and I have some meetings I've been invited to, and I've been really thinking about that. I was going to ask Paul what he thought, because I'm not sure if it's, I would go to these things, but I'm getting a little bit nervous about it.
I feel fine standing outside. I would
Right.
feel better because generally the transmission is not as facile outside, but inside with a lot of people who I don't know. That would feel different. When I'm in the hospital, for example, and we're all in a room, me, the fellows, the residents, I know they're all vaccinated. So I feel more comfortable taking off my mask, even though it's in the hospital. I do. But I know all these people, I know they're vaccinated. We're all in the room together. So if you're vaccinated and asymptomatic, I think your chances of spreading the virus is really very, very low.
Very, very low.
Wedding? Go to a wedding now inside? What would you do?
I would go to a wedding, but actually my daughter's engaged now and is getting married soon, and I'm going to her wedding.
Good. We're glad.
I will. I mean, if we'll see. It depends on. It also depends on the community. I mean, in sort of vaccine, how much virus is circulating in the community is also part of that.
Sure.
So it was in Mississippi or Missouri. I feel a little different.
Right. Pick your wedding venue carefully is the answer. What about a classroom? So let's talk about, faculty member in a classroom. We know that students are mostly vaccinated. We're upwards of 90% now, but there are going to be some vaccine exceptions in your classroom. Everyone's going to be masked, so you won't know who's vaccinated or who's not. Imagine you're teaching, 100-person class for 3 hours. How do you feel about that?
Can I ask a question? The 10% who don't get vaccinated, what's the reason for not getting vaccinated?
So I don't think it'll be 10%. We're still, pulling out the data as the students come back to campus, but some of them have medical exemptions. We have a process now for submitting. We haven't reviewed them yet. So I think there'll be very few that actually are granted a medical exemption. And some of them have religious exemptions, which again, the bar is going to be high. There's a very rigorous review process. But let's imagine we end up with 3% unvaccinated at the end of the day. There'll still be some students that you won't know about in your classroom. Does that worry you, or do you feel like with the 97% vaccination coverage and everyone in masks, things are okay? Because this is the question we're getting from a lot of faculty, and they're saying, and I have young kids at home.
Is there a mask mandated, Penn? I mean,
Yes, there is. Yep.
So
Indoor.
Most people are masked. Well, I think you're pretty good. I mean, it's not. The goal is mitigating risk, not eliminating risk. I mean, when you walk outside, you haven't eliminated risk. But I think that dramatically mitigates the risk.
Good. I agree. Susan?
I agree. I would feel comfortable. Of course, I never teach 100 people at one time, but I did go to the med school orientation, and they had 150 med students in one room with masks, and then we were a panel in the front, but we did take off our masks to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mm-hmm. We weren't that close. We were probably the 6 feet apart.
Right. So another person asks, this is to you, Paul. I have a 7.5-year-old, and I believe my country's taken the wrong decision to send under 15 to school without taking the proper measures such as social distancing. Except for masks, do you think we should have influenza vaccines for our children? I think they mean COVID vaccines for our children. Any advice on what we can do to protect our children?
Right. So there obviously vaccines can be given to anyone who's 12 and older. We talk about correctly how we really want vaccines for children, but nonetheless, only about 35% of people have vaccinated the 12 to 17-year-olds. So the vaccines don't work as a concept. You actually have to give them. If I was a parent of a 7.5-year-old, I would be worried. I mean, I would like to believe that I'm going to a school where the teachers are mandated to receive a vaccine. I'd like to believe I'm going to a school where everybody in that school, is masked, because that's your only choice. We all agree that on-site learning is much better than virtual learning. I mean, we were so careful last year. I mean, many of the public schools were closed, but private schools were open. But when they were open, they were so careful about masking and social distancing. We didn't have a vaccine. And generally we were pretty good. When we were in the cafeteria, we didn't, we separated ourselves, which you had to eat. But I do worry. I mean, it's a bad combination. It's a highly transmissible virus. You're heading into the winter when arguably the virus is more easily transmitted in cooler, drier climates. Our behavior is not as good as it was. And there are certain communities in this country that are, where the virus is still raging. That's a bad combination to have a group of people together who are completely susceptible, i.e. the less than 12-year-old. And you saw that. There was just in MMWR in Marin County, California, there was a teacher who was unmasked, unvaccinated, and proceeded to infect 24 children in her classroom. I mean, as a personal choice, right? This is a personal freedom. I'm telling you, in a better world, she should be held accountable for reckless endangerment. I really do feel it's in that category.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a minute. I mean, you touched on it, and it was a question I really wanted to get into, this notion of, I mean, we need a constitutional lawyer here, but do we have the right to say I can choose what I want to do with my own body when we have this kind of public health risk? And does that public health benefit of vaccination trump individual liberties in some cases? I happen to believe it does. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. So I mean, this is I would argue settled law. I mean, the Jacobson v. Massachusetts case in 1905 was the case of a Lutheran minister, Henning Jacobson, who was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts during a smallpox epidemic. The Cambridge Board of Health said that he had to either get a vaccine, right? This is 1905, early 1900s, or pay a fine. So that's what a mandate is. A mandate is you are asked to get a vaccine or pay some sort of societal price, whether it's an actual fine or you don't get to work in the hospital or go to the school, whatever. That's what a mandatory vaccine. I'll get to compulsory vaccine in a second, because there's only one instance in American history of compulsory vaccination, and it happened in Philadelphia. But that went all the way initially to a state Supreme Court, then the United States Supreme Court, which then supported Cambridge Board of Public Health's capacity to mandate a vaccine. That went 17 years later. In the case of Zuck v. King, there was a girl who wanted to go to high school, but the high school insisted on her getting a smallpox vaccine. There wasn't a smallpox epidemic at the time, but that just again reaffirmed the earlier ruling. So a compulsory vaccine, so that's mandatory vaccination. I mean, can you compel people to vaccines, but to get a mandatory vaccine? Yes. The only instance of compulsory vaccination took place in Philadelphia in 1991. That was, I don't know if Susan remembers this, but there was a measles epidemic in the city of Philadelphia in a few months in 1991, where 1,400 cases of measles and 9 deaths in one city over a 3-month period. To put that in perspective, a couple of years before, there were 1,500 cases of measles in the country and fewer than 5 deaths. I mean, that's how bad that was. It centered on 2 fundamentalist churches in the city, Faith Tabernacle, First Century Gospel. There were faith healing churches, so they didn't believe in vaccination, not that it's a belief system, it's an evidence-based system. And so that what happened was we got to the point where there's 500 of the cases and 6 of the deaths were in that community, 900 of the cases and 3 of the deaths were in the surrounding community, because the virus doesn't recognize your religious beliefs. So the city was in a panic. I mean, people canceled trips to the city. I mean, the state, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to vaccinate down to 6 months of age because we were so overwhelmed by this. And that what eventually happened is the state Supreme Court argued that there could be compulsory vaccination, meaning that those children could be vaccinated against their parents' will. So the pastor of one of the churches went to the ACLU, right? I mean, a group that's perfectly willing to represent unpopular causes like neo-Nazis marching down the street of Skokie, Illinois, or the Westboro Baptist Church, protesting funerals. And so it went to the ACLU to do something that was perfectly legal. What those parents were doing by not vaccinating their children was perfectly legal. We had a religious exemption to vaccination that had been on the books for 10 years. Everybody assumed the ACLU would represent them, but they didn't. They said that while it is your liberty to martyr yourself to your religion, you are not at liberty to martyr your child to your religion. And so eventually we had compulsory vaccination and the epidemic stopped.
Wow. That's a great story. I'd forgotten that. And I do remember now that you bring it up. That's a great answer. Thank you. Okay, a couple more questions. Let's try and sneak some in. Natural immunity versus vaccine-induced immunity. What do we say? What do we think? I mean, obviously everyone's saying the best would be to get the natural disease and then get vaccinated on top of it, or vice versa. But what do you both think about the quality or the robustness of immunity from naturally occurring disease versus vaccine?
The only thing I'm not an expert on this at all. Paul probably is better, but the one thing about natural immunity is that you're going to get immunized against all the proteins the virus makes, not just the spike protein. So if the virus should infect us, so if the virus is not completely neutralized by the spike antibodies and it starts to replicate, you're going to have a more broad immunity. I don't know in practice whether this really is more protective against severe disease. Paul may have ideas about that, but.
Yeah, so there's a couple studies. One, there was a study done in the Cleveland Clinic months ago of healthcare workers who had either been vaccinated or naturally infected only, and followed them up and found that both were protective, not surprising. Then there was a study that just came out of Israel just in the past few days, arguing that natural infection was actually better than immunization. The problem with that study is that the numbers were small, so it was hard to. I think you can fairly conclude that natural infection is protective against severe disease as vaccination is. Now, there was a study in Kentucky looking at people who were naturally infected and vaccinated. as compared to naturally infected only. And those who were naturally infected and vaccinated, not surprising because there's a boost to vaccinating, had a 2.5-fold lesser incidence of symptomatic disease going forward with exposure than those who were naturally infected but not vaccinated. But that's not surprising.
Well, what about
We're gonna have-
any difference in severe disease between the two? Or just
For naturally infected versus vaccinated only?
no, naturally infected
plus, yeah.
versus only naturally infected?
Yeah, no, I think there was I don't think that, no, I think there was symptomatic but not severe. So sort of like
Okay.
mild, moderate. So that's a great question. I don't think that the study was big enough to find.
So there's going to be COVID parties where people try and get it on top of their vaccination, so they get super immune.
Yeah, never a good idea.
What about the rollout for young children? What do you think the timeline for vaccination for under 5 might be, Paul?
Or under 12. I mean,
Under 12, sorry.
Yeah,
And then under 5. You can do both.
you'd think as a member of as a voting member of the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, I would have any idea how to answer this question. The word on the street basically is that we probably won't be reviewing those data. Our committee won't be reviewing those data till earliest would be the end of this year, maybe not till later. But it is a shame. I mean, you'd like to have a vaccine as these kids head into school, but that's not going to happen.
And how about the under 5? Are we even starting there? Are we?
Yeah, no, their data are being generated, but I think it's going to be sequential, just as it's already happened, right? First it was 16 to 17-year-old, then 12 to 15. Now we'll go down to 5 to 12.
Okay.
We're down.
One question that's come up repeatedly in the chat, and I think I would appreciate both of your thoughts on this. What is a good source of information on COVID and on vaccination for the non-scientific type? A lot of people have asked that. So they're looking for a website to go to that they can trust. And I think that's really important.
Well, our Vaccine Education Center answers COVID questions every day. And
Yes, it does.
Every day. So, vaccine.chop.edu is one. The CDC has a good website. There's a group called Vaccinate Your Family, which has a good website. So there are good websites out there. Just don't go to the ones where they're selling you something, because that's probably not a good website.
Right. And I think your center talks about adults and children, even though it's based out of CHOP. So that's important for people to know. Yeah. What do you think, Susan?
I was just going to mention Johns Hopkins has a good website that they a lot about the viruses and the variants and that kind of stuff. It's not terribly technical.
Mm-hmm. And I love Paul Osterholm in the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy. So he also has a podcast, and he's a Midwestern. He's sort of gentle and gives a lot of good information in a very digestible way, I will say.
Mike Osterholm.
I like to listen to Peter Hotez also.
Yeah.
I like to listen to him anyway, out of Texas.
So I think we're probably getting close to the end. Do either of you have any closing comments you'd like to give to the audience to just help us move forward through these challenging times? This has been really, really helpful.
Get vaccinated.
Tell us we shouldn't be that nervous. Tell us that we can return to somewhat normal lives, although wearing masks and socially distancing.
I can just say for myself, I don't really feel that nervous.
Yeah.
Being unrealistic, but staying mostly around people that are vaccinated, wearing a mask when I have to, spending time outside.
Mm-hmm.
But now it's going to be more difficult as the weather changes. But yeah, I think we'll slowly get back to normal. I'm optimistic.
Philadelphia's doing well. I mean, that's 65% immunization rate in Philadelphia. We're generally very good. I mean, I think they're interested in mandating vaccines for teachers. We're good with mask mandates. City of Philadelphia is actually pretty good here.
And so is campus, I'll say. So we've started gateway testing for the students as they come back on. We're under 1%. We hope it stays there. And as I said, upwards of 90% vaccinated for faculty, staff, and students. So I think that Penn is going to be one of the safer places to be. Let's think about it that way.
I also, a lot of people stayed away so long that it's hard to come back. I mean, in my environment, people didn't really stay out for a year. So maybe it takes time to get used to being there and getting less nervous about it all, I think.
I wanted to thank the panelists. If we were at Perry World House, there would be a roaring, thunderous applause to all of you for such a wonderful and robust conversation today. I feel like we're at a moment in this virus's evolution when many of us are still very hungry for very practical information and far greater understanding than we have. And the more fact-based, science-based information we can have, the better off we'll be. And not just for now, but also, for the inevitable future outbreaks that you've all referenced in one way or another. It's
Mhm.
been wonderful to have you here at Perry World House, although virtually, and we're hoping to have you in the building soon. Also, I wanted to just thank the world's best audience for joining us and for posing such insightful and sophisticated questions. We won't be holding the World Today next Tuesday on Rosh Hashanah, but we hope to see you all the following week on September the 14th, when we'll be hosting a critical conversation on Afghanistan and its future. To receive more information and the links to register for the Afghanistan program, please join our mailing list or keep an eye out on our website, where we'll upload more details in the coming days. As always, you can access a recording of this phenomenal conversation on our YouTube channel and can find out about our other upcoming events by joining our mailing list and following us on social media for timely information on critical global affairs and public policy issues. We'll drop links to those in the chat as well. Be well and see you next time. And thanks to our panel again.